Thank you again for the opportunity to follow up with this second webinar. So I'd also like to thank Martin for a really interesting presentation on what's happening in Sweden, and a great example for the world, I feel. And really what's happening to us is happening to us as one global community, and we need to learn from each other and work together. It's the only way. And Sweden is an example of having done exactly that through its voluntary measures. So let's have a look. With the reopening of Indonesia, what actually are the priorities? Obviously, there's health and there's economic advancement. And what we need to achieve is a balance between the two. We can't have one prioritizing over the other because the risks to the country are too great. So if we don't prioritize economic advancement, then the country will suffer. It's not what anyone wants, obviously. If that did happen, then the economy would contract. So that's nothing that any of us want to see. People's livelihoods would be affected, and people's well-being would be affected. So the point there is that economic well-being is actually tied to personal well-being. They go together. So if we look at it in terms of responsibility, what is the responsibility in this? We need to ensure that the economic sting or the impact from COVID-19 is not unnecessarily protracted. So there is definitely an economic impact, of course, from the restrictions around the globe, whatever individual country's experience of that is. But our responsibility as a responsible society, if you like, is to ensure that the economic impact does not get protracted or is not longer lasting than it needs to, and that it is minimized. This is very important. So in terms of Indonesia, we need to get your economy moving again. We need to do so sensibly, maturely, and responsibly. So what we're going to look at in this presentation today is two things. First of all, the safety protocol, which is absolutely essential. I spoke about that last time. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it today, but we'll make reference to it. And the second thing is, how do we reopen education? So that is very much a discussion of practicalities, and we'll look at both of those. So first, if we look at it from a bigger picture, reopening and life post-COVID-19. First of all, is there actually a post-COVID? Well, actually, no, there's not. What there is instead is a new standard and a new normal. We need to get used to that being the case, as it's going to be from now on. And so now is the time to introduce change. We need to start looking at it from a bigger picture and what's needed in terms of development going forward. So the challenges for Indonesia are obviously the balance between safety and obviously health on the one hand, and economic development. And as I said before, economic well-being and personal well-being are definitely tied together. Obviously, one of the critical elements is crowd control, and the now very commonly used term across the world, which is social distancing. As well as that, there needs to be a public understanding of risk. So if we take Australia as an example, following on from Martin's wonderful presentation on Sweden, let's look at what's happening in Australia. So Australia's approach has been structured and coordinated in terms of getting ready to reopen. So the federal government, the central government, and all of the states, or what you call regional governments, are in agreement about the way to make that happen. And then the states and territories are each responsible for rolling out their own plan. So the federal plan or the central plan is overarching, but the states fit within that. And then the states decide on their own timing and the details of how they're going to roll out that central plan. So the central or federal government has given the states authority to decide on their own timing and their own details. And then the federal government has said, of course, that all people must follow their state's plan. So what we have is governments working together. And that's very important in order for it to be effective. So the reopening is staged. In other words, it's occurring in steps, not reopening all at once, but in steps. And this is leading towards what we're calling a COVID-safe economy, where new standards apply that become our new normal. Certainly won't be the same as before for any of us across anywhere in the world. So what is the staged plan of Australia? There is an image there on your screen of the 3-step framework for a COVID-safe Australia. If anyone wants a copy of that, you're more than welcome to ask for it, and I'll make sure you get it. If you contact the organisers of today's webinar, then I can provide it to them. So in each of those 3 steps, industries are named, what can open and when, in a certain order that is going to keep things safe. So it talks about things like what numbers of people are allowed to gather and what restrictions apply. So in Australia, a structured approach with a lot of voluntary measures works in Australia, but why? Because people have been educated on the importance of following the standards. There is an awareness across the community that what one person does affects everyone. So there's an understanding that it's a shared responsibility. And then there is police enforcement if the standards are breached, but people are asked to be responsible and in social distancing to only go out when it's necessary. Obviously, to get food, to do anything that's necessary for life to go on. People are expected to just go about their daily routine. But if there's irresponsibility in that, then the police will enforce the standards. For instance, if people get too close together, such as has happened on beaches because it's still very hot here, and sometimes too many people have gathered on beaches and the police have had to say, okay, you actually need to go home. But there's a general understanding that everyone knows that the standards do matter. So in Indonesia, without criticism at all, because what I see is a massive opportunity for your country. And personally, I want to see Indonesia become a leader, not only in the region, but in the world. So the comments I'm going to offer are from that very much high regard for your country and your people. So how can Indonesia achieve a coordinated approach? Education is absolutely key. There needs to be education delivered to the people that safety really does matter. But they need to know how to be safe, because it may seem basic, especially to those who are educated in infection control and hygiene, safe work practices, etc. But a lot of people don't know how to actually stay safe, and they need to be educated. And that was one of the primary reasons why Equinim developed a free online module of education in basic hygiene control and infection control, which was delivered to universities in Indonesia. When people know how to be safe, they feel confident, and that's very, very important. When people feel confident, they get back out into life again, and the economy can be re-sparked in a safe way. So building the confidence by educating people is critical to getting the economy moving again. So where do you start? So as we talked about last time, a safety protocol is absolutely important to Indonesia's future, starting now. A safety protocol is a norm. It's a new standard, and it's something that's widely adopted. And as we talked about last time, that requires training, certification, and regulation. All of those are critical to the success of a safety protocol to be rolled out across the country. That sets new standards. It's a protocol or framework for all of society to follow. It can apply to different industries. It can apply, first of all, to priority industries. Indonesia can make that choice. And there's plenty of support here to help you to develop that. So what is the training that the safety protocol would involve? If we use Australia as an example, all Australian official or accredited training is delivered within a protocol or a framework. That is called the Australian Qualifications Framework, or the AQF. So the AQF is a wheel which goes from 1 upwards in terms of levels of education. Or you can look at it as steps. So from 1 through to 10. Vocational education, which we're going to speak about shortly, is levels 1 to 6. And then higher education, or universities, as they are officially defined in Australia, operate from level 6 through to 10. Infection control, as an example, from what we teach, is the code is set out there, HLT-INF for infection control 004 is at level 4. So just to give you an example, that module of learning is all about establishing a framework for infection prevention and control, establishing procedures for hazard identification and risk control, implementing and monitoring infection prevention and control practices, and evaluating infection prevention and control performance. In other words, once you've got it in place and you know what to do, is it actually working? It needs to be monitored to make sure. So basic infection control standards, there are many, and here's some examples. So there needs to be an understanding of hazard identification and risk control. Personal hygiene is extremely important. Use of PPE, or personal protective equipment, across all industries as a standard. Handling and transport of potentially infectious material. What is the safe way of doing that? Limitation of contamination. If contamination does occur, it needs to be limited or contained. Cleaning and maintenance need to be standard, and they need to be of a high enough level to protect people's safe health. Knowing the ways that infection is spread is also important. Knowing the types of hazards and risks that exist. Knowing the control methods. In other words, how do you control those hazards and risks? If something occurs, what do you do to minimize, if not eliminate, the risk? And then, of course, there's communication of responsibilities to relevant people in workplaces so that people know what their job is in relation to implementing proper infection control standards. And then once everything's in place, it needs to be monitored to make sure that it works. If that was rolled out to all sectors, or at least priority sectors, then you would start to see a difference. But not only do we need training for a safety protocol, we also need certification. In other words, it has to be backed. If it was backed by Indonesian public health bodies, the leaders in public health, and leading bodies such as Kadin and Aptizi, all of which are extremely highly regarded in Indonesia and for very good reason. And also, if it's actually backed by government for credibility and endorsement, that is a major policy step, a major step forward for Indonesia, which shows leadership. In other words, there are three arms: training, certification, and then regulation by government. And the last step, regulation, is in making the training mandatory so that it is mandatory to be rolled out, even if it is contextualized. And what that means is even if it is adapted to apply to specific industries, it is in your interests as a nation to roll out this safety protocol nationally. And we are absolutely here to support you. So let's look at the practicalities of reopening. And in this, we'll look at education. So as we head towards reopening, what actually matters? Like in Sweden, education has not actually shut down in Australia. It's remained open. The schools have remained open. Most of the universities and higher education providers, vocational education providers, have postponed their on-campus classes. So classes are not physically going ahead, but everything has moved online. It's a very changed landscape. It's different now. Education is different, and it's going to be different from now on. So we need to support the education institutions. And I know that many institutions are represented in this webinar today, so welcome and thank you for coming. And we need to support the public to know what is actually needed in these important next steps. So with campuses reopening, we can look at what we've done as a case study. For instance, we've developed two significant components which to us are key for reopening, and we're very, very happy to share them with you. First of all is COVID training online for all lecturers, which is compulsory for all lecturers to undertake the online COVID module, which we have developed before they go back on campus. And then there's a protocol for reopening campuses. And if we look at these in a little bit more detail, the COVID training is online and every lecturer needs to do it. We've offered this to the Australian government, and they are talking about it with us at the moment because there's a possibility that they may roll it out more widely, which we would fully welcome. And that's why we developed it, to be used for the protection of people. And secondly, our campus protocol includes crowd control, or in other words, how you apply with social distancing. So looking at things like the number of people in classrooms, having staggered breaks across a university or a campus to minimize the people moving at the same time. Infection control measures need to become normal, and people need to understand what that means and what to do. So there needs to be a safety protocol rolled out across the campus. We have this for us here in Australia and obviously can help you. In addition, there needs to be student screening. There are particulars to this, and just to give you examples, if a student has symptoms that are like the flu, then they shouldn't go on campus. If they're living with someone and have been in close contact with someone who has been diagnosed with COVID-19, then for the safety period of 14 days, they shouldn't go on campus, but then they can come back and things like that. All lecturers and students must follow that protocol. So again, it's about working together to make it safe for everyone. So what's next? But again, beyond the protocol and the COVID training that we're rolling out for trainers, for lecturers, there is a bigger picture, and now is the time to look at it. Indonesia needs to think beyond just opening the doors to campuses. Take this opportunity to embrace what is next and to grow as a nation. So that means that we can look at the future of education and see that COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to do so. There is a new way. Educators need to move in line with this new way. So what is that new way? Blended learning is very much the future of education. So what is blended learning? Blended learning is face-to-face and e-learning working together. They're both important. Equinim and our associates have worked in this way for many years, and we're leaders in this in Australia. Students get the same quality in learning whether they attend face-to-face or whether they do it all by e-learning. And that to us is an absolute priority. So in Australia, the government's COVID response was there's no shutdown of education, but a recommendation to move to online learning. So move online as much as possible was the guideline issued to Australian education institutions. Our regulator of education providers said the same thing, go online. Social distancing applies in the classroom. That makes e-learning critical. Sometimes with social distancing, it's very difficult to teach in a face-to-face environment. And we know that social distancing is likely to be with us for some time. So e-learning is indeed the new norm. Some providers, like our group, have been doing it for years, and we're well and truly prepared. Others, including in Australia, are just coming up to speed now, but that's okay. There's an opportunity. So how is e-learning best used? E-learning can be used on its own, or it can be part of a blended model. We do both. Some courses we deliver entirely online, and some we deliver both e-learning or online and face-to-face, and sometimes the students just choose which way they'd like to go. E-learning is becoming extremely popular in Australia, and students are expecting it. because they know that they can have access to their education anywhere and on absolutely any device. Our technology works on any device at all, including mobiles, tablets, iPads, whatever technology people are using, they can access their education. The possibilities are definitely advanced. So with our systems, for instance, we use artificial intelligence to inform the way that our learning and our assessment is delivered. That's really important because it means that what we deliver is personalized. They don't just get a one-size-fits-all, they get something that works for them. And we have a special platform which is absolutely unique in Australia that allows us to teach and assess online, where we can view live students all over the country performing hands-on tasks, and we can assess them, and they can communicate directly with our lecturers, and they can get feedback, and they can be assessed as to whether they have met the standards or not and need to do some more work. So all of that with our platform can actually be done online. So what about Indonesia? E-learning is not yet developed, and it needs to be. So let's look at why. So with Indonesia, you've got such a large population, but it's impractical for that reason to roll out adequate education nationwide face-to-face, not with Indonesia's ambition to become a leader in the region and globally. That requires a lot of education to happen fast. To set up the infrastructure for face-to-face rollout across your very large population would take too long, and it's too expensive. E-learning will actually support your country to build. And the infrastructure to support that, in other words, connectivity, so internet connection, must be prioritized. And that's not just for education, it's for economic development as well. So what type of education is needed? May I suggest, as I have for a number of years now, that vocational education is what's actually needed in Indonesia. And why? Indonesia simply does not need, well, it's actually 260 million PhDs. You don't need that. Indonesia needs skills. So if we look at skills, why are they important? Skills training, why is that important? First of all, if you have skilled workers, that is what powers your industry. And industry is what powers your economy. So it starts with skilled workers. And the way to develop skills is vocational education. That is actually vocational education's job. It is entirely focused on skills needed for industry. So what has COVID taught us? It's taught us that e-learning can teach skills. We've been doing it for years, but others are getting online and realizing that you can teach skills online. E-learning is important. E-learning carries less health risk for obvious reasons, but it has to be done properly, and I can't emphasize that enough. In other words, it has to be done with quality. So how do you actually achieve this? If we look at the current problems, and I don't like to call them problems, I like to call them opportunities in Indonesia.
Serryn, excuse me, Serryn, our time is only 5 minutes. Can you make it faster?
Yes, I will go fast. Thank you very much. So public perception is very important, as is the need for government and industry backing. At the moment, public perception is not trusting of e-learning in Indonesia, from what I understand. People don't see it as being as trustworthy as face-to-face. Now, we used to have that in Australia, but we don't anymore. E-learning is now standard here. It's accepted as being standard. So how do you achieve that? You need to put quality products into the market so people can experience the value that e-learning can bring. Introduce training that is exemplary in this regard so people can learn from it. And then you'll set a standard for how e-learning is to be applied. So in Australia, we have been asked by the Australian National Regulator to provide a case study on how to do e-learning properly. We've provided it to them, and that's going to be published nationally as an example to show other education institutions how you do it. So what else do you need? You need backing from industry and from government. And how do you get that? From government, if you develop a framework or a protocol for e-learning, as in what's important, and you tailor that for Indonesia, then you can have a leading body, such as Public Health University, take that to government and recommend that it be adopted. So in summary, a coordinated approach to reopening definitely works best, and that's achieved through education. Educate your people about how to be safe. Training in a safety protocol that goes out to industry and means reopening occurs safely for everyone's benefit. Education, a new way, is definitely needed, as we know, and that means moving to online. But focus on quality and don't let that go. Online is not a lesser form of education. It must be equal to face-to-face. Use technology, but use it wisely, and learn from experts who have, through trial and error, worked out what works and what doesn't, and then get backing from government and from industry. And does this actually matter? It matters very much. Indonesia's economy has suffered through this, as has the rest of the world. The regions are saying that they have very little money. Things have stopped or at least slowed in the regions, and people have left certain regions, such as all of the many, many students in Yogyakarta. The new way is definitely needed, and restarting the economy in this sensible and mature way that I've discussed with you today is how it's going to work. So kicking that new way into gear requires government backing at the central level, and it requires industry endorsement. And why does Indonesia need this? Because your economic success is very important, and this is important for the people's well-being. The two are absolutely linked, and education is critical. Use education to demonstrate your leadership as a country, leadership in the way that people are educated so they know how to deal with COVID. If they are prepared, they're more confident. This boosts the economy and invites tourism back. Resparking the tourism industry in Indonesia is critical because it's a major industry for your country. If tourists from overseas are confident to visit your country because they know that your industries and your people are educated in how to implement proper infection control, then tourists will feel confident in coming back to Indonesia. And that's what we want. That's very good for Indonesia. So use training, but use it to build your people. You need to be responsible and mature in the next steps that you take. And that is the leadership that is called for and that is absolutely on offer. There's no need for the chaos and the confusion that currently exist. If you build your people and prepare them for the future, then you will re-spark the economy and really get it going. So it's all about education and training, which puts people first. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Okay.
I absolutely appreciate it.